I'm very excited about the potential for AI in music making. I guarantee you that's where the next big wave of musical innovation is going to come out of. It's going to come from kids getting their hands on this cheap AI technology, feeding songs they like, songs they don't like into it, seeing what weird shit pops out of it, and then editing that to make something out of it. You know, if you just take raw AI generated music, it's generally not that listenable. But if you get a musician working on it and they can find those things, you know, the way AI art will have too many fingers on your hands or whatever, or too many eyes on your face, they'll get those valley of the uncanny weirdness and then be able to put it into a structure that works like a song.
Blogger and podcaster Nathan Wilcox returns to the Plutopia podcast. We explore the emergence of ChatGPT, music and art created with artificial intelligence, the evolution of dance music, changes in the Austin music scene, streaming music, and of course, politics.
Nate, welcome
Hey.
to our podcast.
Happy to be here.
How are you doing?
Doing all right. It's been an interesting 2023 so far.
What's been happening?
Well, I got laid off from my job, and then I got sort of semi-reinstated to my job. And so
I figured they would do that. I mean,
It's
how many
temporary.
how many really smart bloggers are there out there, or is it
There's
blogging
infinite
more?
really smart bloggers out there, I think, or pretty close. That's how the market treats us anyway.
And they're
But,
all named ChatGPT, right?
Watch out for Chat. It's coming for your job.
Yep. Some exciting possibilities with the chat technology. But,
Well, that's definitely worth talking about. You know, I've been in a debate for at least a couple of days now with people who are concerned that ChatGPT will take jobs from journalists. And my comment was that any journalist who could be replaced by ChatGPT as a journalist, I would not be reading anyway.
Well, I'll agree with that. But on the other hand, if it gets really, really good to where you can't tell the difference when it passes the Turing test or the bullshit test of its output, then it might be worth worrying about.
You know, I mean, it's not going to happen. It's never going to be like really high quality authorship, right?
no,
It's
but
going to,
it does show signs of being able to do things like report a baseball game, you know, reasonably well, even with quotes. So, you know, as a publisher and editor and blogger, I can see utility for it. You know, it would let me write maybe 5 times as much content as I could write by myself. And you just need to get it started, then proofread it and edit it, and you can have something valuable. The problem with it seems to be, though, that if the algorithm takes in data and feeds in enough information and writing that it's reading, and supposedly if it's cut off from new data for very long, it will lose track of what humans write like. And so it can't ultimately replace everything, because there's it's sort of like soil. When you farm it too much and the nutrients get stripped out, if you look at content mills or content farms, there's very little there. I mean, there might be an article that meets the SEO requirements so that Google will point you at it, but when you read it, you can usually tell no actual thought went into this. And you know, if you don't refresh the AI with new data, new prose written by real human beings, it strip mines itself and gets
garbage in, garbage
further,
out.
further and further removed from reality. So I'm less worried about the jobs impact than I am the sort of brain impact. I mean, we're exposing ourselves to so much content that's devoid of any qualities or value other than raw information transmission. It just can't be good for our brains or our culture, you know. Like, you see these pages that are just SEO mills, and you know, it's the written equivalent of empty calories. There's nothing there.
But are people
So
really reading that stuff?
yeah, I mean, they're scanning it, they're skimming it, and when you're Googling for something and you're looking for information, sometimes you'll find articles like that are valuable, but usually you can tell when it's just something trying to get you to click on an Amazon affiliate link or whatever their particular scam angle is. And it's, got extremely limited utility. But
Yeah.
I'm very excited about the potential for AI in music making. I guarantee you that's where the next big wave of musical innovation is going to come out of. It's going to come from kids getting their hands on this cheap AI technology, feeding songs they like, songs they don't like into it, seeing what weird shit pops out of it, and then editing that to make something out of it. If you just take raw AI generated music, it's generally not that listenable. But if you get a musician working on it and they can find those things, the way AI art will have too many fingers on your hands or whatever, or too many eyes on your face, they'll get those valley of the uncanny weirdness and then be able to put it into a structure that works like a song. And I think spending the last 5 years obsessively studying music history, the times we have the most musical innovation is when young kids get their hands on cheap new equipment. Jimi Hendrix getting his hands on a Fender Stratocaster and a Fender Twin amplifier and going to town, or kids in Detroit in the 80s getting their hands on cheap drum machines and cheap samplers, and boom, you've got techno music. So
Yeah.
it's very hard to make an innovative guitar song today, but it's probably pretty easy to make an innovative AI recording today, and so that's what I've seen is when musicians get their hands on new technologies, that's when innovation happens. And I think AI is just screaming out to be the next thing. It's like so many people complain about auto-tune having killed music or whatever, but then if you actually pay attention to the fans that are following it, the most creative artists out there are using auto-tune to create, like the obvious stupid purpose of auto-tune is I can't sing very well, make me sound like I can sing. But there's other ways to use it where I want to sound like a demon. I'm just going to take this machine and turn all the knobs in all directions and get crazy, weird sounds. And that's what kids are doing, particularly in Jamaica and the drill scene in England and Brooklyn drill and Chicago drill. I mean, there's some pretty cool stuff going on with auto-tune. And so I'm pretty excited to see what musical artists can do with AI. I loved, what is the big AI art app? It's something.
Well, there's one called Dolly and there's another one called Midjourney, and there's probably others besides those. Is that what you're thinking about?
Stable Diffusion is the one I was thinking of, actually. And a friend of mine's a visual artist and sculptor, and he was just going to town making the coolest stuff with the AI art engine, by feeding in, here's the things I want. And then he would get back these weird images, and then he could take the weird images as raw material and then, format them and edit them into really deeply unsettling finished product that totally living in the valley of the uncanny. And he was saying that the cool effects he was getting were already obsolete within a week or two of getting them, because the program had been updated and had fixed a lot of those imperfections that he found so fascinating, and it would stop making the person with the weird third arm coming out of the back. And he's like, no, that's what I want, so he was recognizing that he was working in a medium that was very short-lived, and he's only going to have this technology available at a point where he can manipulate it for a few weeks, and really went to town.
Did you see this image that we used to promote tonight's show?
I did not.
It's an image I created in Dolly.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, and I've been doing that off and on for a few months now, using generative AI to create images for our blurbs. Works pretty well. Yeah. They look kind of horrible, but they're interesting.
Yeah, that's and I think you got to lean in to the distortions. It's just like Jimi Hendrix figuring out, this amplifier making feedback is actually a good thing, and I can actually do cool things with this effect that engineers had worked so hard to try to, eliminate. And so it's kind of a race between the artists going, hey, wait, this is actually cool, let me use this toy, and the engineers going, ooh, this is producing irregular, ugliness. Let's iron out all the kinks in this tool. So there's a point at which the tools are still producing crazy weird shit, and the artists have this opportunity to seize the day.
Do you know of anything that is that we would kind of know that's been produced recently that was produced with AI?
I do not.
Or with an AI component? My argument about AI has always been that it's going to be a support. It's never going to be like the centerpiece.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what you're saying about music, that AI is just another tool in the musician's toolkit.
Yeah.
Yeah. The problem I have with AI, from my viewpoint, I do more producing, that it is a great tool. But what happens with all these new tools is when it becomes so easy and so available for you to create stuff with, then the market gets overwhelmed. But everyone can be a music producer. Everyone can be a musician without a lot of study. It just I listened to some of the things that have been put together, a lot of sampling stuff, and it's interesting. But after a while, I still long for those guys who spent 20 years learning to play their instrument.
Well, if you have amazing creativity and you create music that's very compelling, does it really matter whether you understand the mechanics or whether you created it using some instrumentation that made it easier for you to translate what you were hearing in your head, into something that you could play for others?
I don't see a distinction there. I mean, the best musicians have always been the ones that took shortcuts. Lennon and McCartney couldn't read or write music. But they had a mastery of their instruments, and they could hear, and they could reproduce what they were hearing. But like the economics of music, this was a recurring argument I had with Ed Ward for years and years, that he was very concerned with the catastrophe that happened in the music business around the year 2000, when suddenly recorded music became cheap, became essentially worthless or free, which had never happened before in human history. I mean, we didn't have any recorded music at all until we had sheet music, and that's a pretty poor substitute. Then we had recorded music, by the 1890s. We had quality electrical recording by the 1920s. And, in the early 2000s, then you suddenly had MP3s, and it was very easy to make digital copies of music that wouldn't degrade with reproduction. But the real annihilation of musician jobs happened in the 1920s. Like, if you read accounts of life in America or Europe in the early part of the 20th century, the first decade and a half of the 20th century, there would be two rush hours, because there was a morning rush hour when the workers, went to the factories and things like that. Then there would be another rush hour when the musicians picked up their instrument cases and went out, because any dance hall, any restaurant with music, any performer had to have live musicians. There were no jukeboxes, there were no records, there was no radio. And so musician was a trade that you didn't have to be very good. If you could play a song all the way through, you probably could make some money. And so there's this huge body of mostly mediocre or bad musicians who are making a living playing music. Once songs are being played on the radio, once people can buy records and reproduce that sound at home, the number of jobs for working musicians fell off a table. And that fell off the table 100 years ago, not so much in the 1999, 2006 era that we worry about, home taping is killing music or whatever. The real death knell of working musicians happened when we invented recorded music. So, I I understand and feel the argument for, there are too many people making music. It's not like, in the 1930s, Robert Johnson could get on a bus or hitchhike, and if he had his guitar case, somebody would say, "Hey, mister, can you play that guitar? I've got a nickel. Let me hear you
Yeah.
play it." Because people were starved to hear music just because you couldn't hear music. And but now music is everywhere. People, you probably have 4 people in your house playing 4 different songs at any given time, all in their headphones. And it's changed the way we interact with music dramatically. But I don't think it's just as simple as, oh, technology bad, it's too easy to make music. I mean, historically, music was made by communities. I mean, in Africa, there was no distinction between musician and audience. Everybody in the community made music together. And there might have been certain performers or singers or whatever that people wanted to hear more of, but it wasn't this exalted thing, musician on the stage lording it over everyone else and the audience being quiet and consuming. It was people creating together. And I don't know, every change we make changes other things, and it's just a constant adaptation to change. I don't think there was ever like a perfect period or a better period, but we're just in a period where it's really cheap and easy to make high quality recorded music. And most of the time that's not going to be very good or very interesting.
And few are making a whole lot of money doing it, right? But the way that you make money now is, this kind of goes back to the origination of music as a business. Is like, you got to go out and play it live somewhere to make money. For most musicians, this is true. I mean, you may have somebody like Beyonce who can cut an album. She never has to do anything to support it. She will, but she doesn't have to.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, their music's so all over the place now. There's so much of it. And there's not a single piece of music that is released that you can't listen to through your streaming service, which you're only paying, what, 10 or 12 bucks for, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea. There still is music that you can't get on streaming, but it's rarer and rarer. I mean, there's music people are deliberately making to not put on streaming services, or, make sure that it's not recorded or whatever. But yeah, I mean, it's this process and constant change and people adapting to change, and I don't know, there's been a lot of interesting stuff. I mean, the process of, or the reality of dance music when it required live bands, before jukeboxes, before discotheques. And disco just means somebody playing records in a club, no need for a live band. It doesn't mean a particular type of music. It just means playing records rather than playing instruments. But when you needed a band to play dance music, and dancers almost always want to hear what's the popular new thing, it meant, like in the 1930s, if you were in the Guy Lombardo band and the sweetest orchestra in the world, you would still have to learn some Count Basie songs if Count Basie had a particular hit and your audience wanted to dance to it. They would come up and ask you, hey, play 6 O'Clock Blues or whatever, and you'd have to play that. And that also meant that Count Basie had to deal with what Lawrence Welk and Guy Lombardo were doing, because he would have fans at his crowd saying, hey, play me that new Lawrence Welk Champagne song or whatever. And they'd have to, if they wanted to please the crowd, they would have to say it. And that's what caused this melting pot of influences. And you get things like ragtime and jazz and swing and rhythm and blues and rock and roll and et cetera, because people are having to learn to play each other's music. And once, around the time of Sgt. Pepper's, discos replaced live bands in most places, and a whole bunch of creative stuff came out of that. DJs started becoming musicians and playing records as if they were instruments and making whole new art forms that only came to life when they were being played by the DJs. But at the same time, there were whole generations of rock bands that never had to learn how to make a crowd dance. And I think that was part of, the slow erosion of rock and roll as a popular music. I mean, if you look at these musics, jazz at one point in the 20s and 30s was the dance music in America. If people were dancing to it, it was probably jazz. If you ask people what they were dancing to, they'd probably say, I'm dancing to jazz. And by our definitions, it might not be jazz. Like, there's no improvisation, or it's not based in the blues or whatever, but it's dudes with cornets and drums and basses and guitars playing in 2/4, 4/4 time in a beat you can dance to. But then after World War II, the beboppers came along and made jazz and art music. Suddenly nobody's dancing to jazz anymore, which creates this opportunity for rhythm and blues and rock and roll. And rhythm and blues and rock and roll, well, not rhythm and blues, but rock and roll abdicated dance music in the late 60s. And that's when disco and then hip hop and electronic dance music come in and sees that opportunity. I don't know where I'm going with this, but
yeah, I saw a pretty amazing thing the other day where it was Hans Zimmer. I'm sure you know Hans Zimmer, who used to be, what was he? It was in some like pop group at one time, but eventually he became like the greatest of all film composer, or the most popular and prolific right now, arguably, film composer. And what Hans Zimmer had done was that he had painstakingly recorded every instrument in the orchestra. Basically, he fed all of that into this. He's got this instrument that's basically a keyboard, and he can play the whole orchestra through this keyboard.
It sounds like a mellotron.
Yeah. And it basically he uses it to compose. When they're actually playing the music for the soundtrack, he'll get the orchestra, But he does his composition with this thing. But it's kind of amazing when you hear him playing this thing, and it's a little hard to tell the difference. Yeah, it's like a mellotron. It's like a very advanced, very sophisticated mellotron. And incidentally, I just saw something that said that one person, can you guess who has already used AI to create recorded music? I bet you can guess who I'm thinking, who it is.
Was it Zimmer?
No, it's Brian Eno.
Oh, Brian Eno, of course. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, he is the man.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all, because he is always looking for different ways of creating, whatever's inside of his head as music. Talking about the dance music. Back when I was managing and working with bands in the Bay Area in the 70s and 80s, bands pretty much had to start out being copy bands, because that's what most of the clubs around the Bay Area wanted. They wanted a dance club, and people had to really be popular and have a lot of original dance music to do that. So most bands had to go in and learn everybody else's songs. And if you wanted to become an original music artist, you suddenly became unemployable at a lot of the clubs. And so it was a bad thing for some musicians to change from being a dance music band to being an original music band. But that was what we went through with a couple of different bands, and income dropped dramatically, but these bands ended up getting signed. So that's kind of what you had to bite the bullet and write your own stuff and make it happen, because there's only going to be a certain number of clubs in those days that would book you.
Yeah. And there's a big change. You can see it. It happens pretty fast in the historical record, where a band like the MC5 in Detroit in the mid 60s made a living playing high school dances, like made a living, bought their own equipment, bought nice cars as 18, 19-year-olds. Then, they start the Grandy Ballroom and they're playing San Francisco style, ballroom music. But bands just a couple years later, like Grand Funk Railroad that comes along just a couple years later, they never had that opportunity to make a living as a band. And they had to go through that whole process of finding financial backers and finding, it was a big, expensive process just to make a demo, at that point. And you'd have to hook up with somebody like Terry Knight, who's going to make you the biggest band in the world, and all that kind of stuff. And you could not work your way up. You read these stories about like 19-year-old Ringo Starr pulling a big wad of cash out of his wallet before they've even made a Beatles record, because they're making so much money playing the ballrooms and the dance halls. And within 10 years, that opportunity is long gone. And the punk bands come along and kind of invent a means for new bands to play original music, but it's pretty much like art music. I mean, you have people that will come see these bands, but you don't hear stories about punk bands making a living playing music before they had a record out in the 80s, the way that you would hear about bands in the 60s making a nice living just by having a live gig. Like Waylon Jennings had a gig in there in Phoenix and was making buku money in the early 60s playing to a few thousand people a night, but within 15 years that opportunity didn't exist for country artists either, because they were competing with records and discos and jukeboxes just like everybody else.
There's a big controversy going on in Austin right now about musicians not being able to live in Austin. Many have moved out. A lot of them moved to my neighborhood out here in Bastrop County, simply
or
because
Lockhart.
The city that we knew so long ago that it was welcoming to musicians and you could go everywhere and find a musician on every street corner. It's not so much anymore. It's just the economy has done it to, not so much the economy even, but development has become the king. Music was king for a while in Austin.
Success.
Development
it's the
king.
Success of Austin and becoming a major urban center. It's on a par with San Francisco or New York or whatever. I mean, any number of places are like this, and they are all expensive. It's expensive to live.
Yeah, and oddly enough, Dallas and Houston have had kind of renaissances because musicians can now, you can live in Oak Cliff in Dallas and live pretty cheaply and plenty of opportunities to play music. So, it's just these cycles that come and go. Austin had a long run as a cheaper than it should have been city. It had more amenities than it should have had for the cost of living for decades. But it seems like that was over by the early 2000s, and then it became a destination for musicians to try to come here and get discovered, which is different than an economy that's actually supporting a lot of working musicians.
I don't think anybody's trying to keep Austin weird anymore.
You still see those stickers around, but I don't.
There's a really long article about Austin in the New Yorker written by Larry Wright,
Yeah.
And I haven't read the whole thing yet. I read maybe half of it and I kind of glanced forward a little bit, but basically the story is that Austin is not the Austin that most of the people who have been here for years remember and knew. And it's really changed. And I don't know what you can do about that.
I don't think there's anything you can do about it, and I don't know that necessarily need to do anything about it. It's
right.
It's a phenomenon that's happening, and individuals have to adapt. But I mean, there's no law that says musicians have to be able to make a living playing music, and for most of our history, musicians were able to make money playing music, but there was no possibility of becoming the Beatles or something. Like this idea that you can become rich and famous playing music. That's a 20th century idea. It's extremely, extremely rare. Before that, even something like Beethoven wasn't wealthy.
Oh yeah. And musicians always complain about, like they're complaining now about how streaming services are cutting them out of their profits, but before it was recording companies, and both are true. I mean, it's true that musicians are probably not getting the cut they deserve of the whatever money is coming in. I suspect with streaming services, though, one of the problems is that nobody's getting that many streams. It's like there's so much out there
in the economy.
Yeah.
At those prices, it's very difficult to make it viable. And also the major labels own most of Spotify, and it's their accounting practices that are the problem. I mean,
yeah,
it's just to me, gotten to the point where it's completely impossible to defend the major labels and the big, the three corporations that control most of the musical IP, which is a terrible term. They're not taking care of the master tapes. Had the story that came out in the New York Times a couple of years ago about the massive fire they had at Universal's warehouse, where they were apparently storing most of their recorded music. The scary thing is that they've managed to bully almost everybody out of talking about that. There was the New York Times reported that maybe 500,000 original recordings were destroyed, and this is like the Louvre. This is Bing Crosby, Billie Holiday, Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly. I mean, name an American artist, they probably had something in that collection. The master tapes were apparently destroyed. Multiple artists filed suit. They lost all the lawsuits. None of the suits that I saw were substantive rulings. They were all judges kind of making quick rulings to throw these cases out. And as corrupt as our electoral and judicial systems are right now, I just don't have any faith in judges to give good rulings. I mean, to me, the last reasonable and positive ruling to come out in the IP space was when the record label sued Betamax and the movie studios sued Betamax in the early 80s. And the judges said, no, you can have Betamax, you can have VCRs. It's okay. If a few commercials get fast forwarded through, that's a fair trade-off for all the utility we're getting from this amazing new technology. Yeah. But then just 10 years after that, when you get to the first rulings about sampling and hip hop, the judge clearly knew nothing about the music and had an attitude that, of course, these black punks aren't making anything valuable. They're just stealing, and it's bad, and they need to stop. And it's just a terrible ruling that caused things like it's cheaper to cover a whole song. So you get something like Puff Daddy covering that Police song, Every Breath You Take or whatever. Very little added value there. They changed a few words. They sampled basically the whole chorus. Have Puff Daddy singing instead of Sting. It's cheaper to license that song to cover than it is to sample a snare drum for 1 second. Like the precedent set it up that, like, if you record yourself shuffling a deck of cards and somebody samples that, they owe you songwriting credit. It's ridiculous. It's completely destructive to creativity and just has set heinous precedents. And I don't see our system producing wise legal rulings on this stuff anytime soon. I mean, I just think we're too corrupt and just in a decadent phase of our society and can't make good decisions anymore.
Oh, well, speaking of corruption, this is go ahead.
You had mentioned the disastrous fire that destroyed many great master tapes. The dirty little secret they don't ever talk about is a lot of those master tapes were garbage already because they were too lazy to go in and care for them properly. I did a lot of analog recording over the years, and I had to do special things on really old analog tapes. If it's a certain type of tape or if it's a certain age, you actually, before you can run it off to make a copy of it, you have to bake the tape in an oven. It's in a special process, and you can only do it once, because as soon as that tape has been run through and re-recorded, the original is going to flake off and disappear.
Oh, wow. And I thought you were baking cookies in there.
Well, a lot of that stuff happened. It happened with the band that I managed, and we had releases that we had to go in and do a baking of our master tape when we released the CD in Germany. And it was just really sad to see that thing, just fall apart after. We were lucky. We rescued it, in time, but a lot of those, they didn't care. It was some African American artist that wasn't a big hit, but was a great musician, and it was a great recording, but it didn't make it to their top 10 list of things we're going to save.
Yeah. I was kind of hoping we could shift gears here. Nate is the great host of the great podcast, Let It Roll. And everybody should be listening to that podcast, especially if you love music. But Nate was also a political consultant for years. And we certainly don't want you out the door without talking about politics. Politics.
I don't know that I have anything good to say about politics right now.
What good could you possibly find to say?
Not much. It's dire times. And I think watching the Democrats struggling to figure out what to do with Biden, and I find it just too coincidental that the classified paperwork suddenly appeared just as re-election season started. And the people that blew the whistle on that were Democrats. They were his lawyers, and so, not to get too paranoid, but I don't think you have to be especially paranoid, because the dude said he wouldn't run again. He's in his 80s. He polls very badly. You'd have to be really dumb to be a leader of the Democratic Party and not be trying to replace Biden. I mean, it's an obvious needs to be done thing.
I don't know. I'm kind of back and forth on that, because I thought initially, I really didn't think he would run again. And now it sounds like he wants to. And I think, oh shit, that might be a problem. But then again, you see him, like his State of the Union speech was pretty good. He's actually accomplished a fuck of a lot, as a president. So maybe he's actually a pretty good president.
I don't think so. I mean, and y'all can hate me for this or whatever, but I think you just have to look at it in pretty big picture terms. And remember that Biden's the same guy who campaigned on, oh my God, we're about to lose 200,000 people to COVID, and any president who loses this many people should resign in disgrace. Well, Biden's presided over the death of 600,000 people. And his COVID czar, Jeff Zients, was bad apple, corrupt dude, who's faced numerous fines and penalties for his business corruption over the years. And the entire thrust of Biden's COVID policy was, let's just stop talking about it. Like they're declaring it no longer an emergency, even though we're close to 1,000 people dying a week of this thing. And it has very real impacts when they declare it no longer an emergency. It means the drugs get more expensive. It means time off gets harder to get. It means, compensation is harder to come by. And it's also insanely stupid to try to pretend we're not having a pandemic for economic reasons, because the pandemic is what ultimately hurts the economy. We've got so many young people who are ill that can't work that it's noticeable. It's statistical. People are going, well, what's this spike? And it's like, well, those appear to be people with long COVID who cannot work. And, so I think that's a pretty big fail. I think the failure to prosecute Trump for January 6th is a monumental failure. I do not have words for the scope of that failure. If you are running a democratic republic and somebody attempts a coup, it doesn't matter how half-assed the coup was. This was a legitimate coup attempt. And we learned from the committees that took way too long to get this information out there. We learned this was pre-planned, that they knew what they were doing. They were stupid and planned it very badly. But there were bad actors in the Trump administration, in the Secret Service, in the Pentagon, in the Capitol Police Corps, who very clearly sabotaged the response to this stuff or prevented any response from happening. And, you read any history about any kind of republic that has faced a coup, and they either prosecute that shit with a quickness or they never do, and they fall to coup.
Well, but they've been prosecuting these guys all along. They haven't prosecuted Trump yet, but they
haven't prosecuted Trump, and it is.
It's not to say they're not going to.
It's 2023. They are not going to. You
Are
don't
you
prosecute
sure?
a coup this way. They might prosecute some more losers, but are they going to go after Trump? No. Do I think Merrick Garland is suddenly going to grow a pair and become a vigilant prosecutor? No, he is not. This is never going to happen. You have to prosecute a coup while it's hot. They needed to do this in spring of 2020 when it happened, because when the leadership responds in a serious way by rounding up the perpetrators and putting them on trial, when you have somebody who is the president of the United States and they attempt a coup, they attempt to overthrow the legally elected government of the United States, that is the most serious crime we have on the books. That is treason. And
Yeah.
that has to be prosecuted immediately. Immediately. You have to perp walk the guy out of the White House that day. And from the beginning, the Democrats treated this as all, well, we'll just act like it's normal and we'll save these committee hearings for right before the 2022 election. And that'll really show them. I mean, I know these people. I've worked for these people. They think of everything in terms of campaign fundraising and then election cycle media and TV ads. That's the only reality they understand. They don't
Yeah.
understand military strategy. They don't understand prosecution. They don't understand anything except this campaign faux reality that they swim in and live in. And they're just not serious people. I mean, you listen to Nancy Pelosi and the things she said, just whether it's, prosecuting somebody for flouting congressional subpoenas or something, but you really never get a sense that, like, when you read about coups or you read about the October Revolution in Russia in 1917, people like Lenin and Trotsky were very, very, very focused on, we have X number of sailors who are on our side. We have this one military unit of the Navy that is very close to the capital. Where can we get these big burly dudes with guns and win? And they were very focused on, how many doors are there to the room? There's 4 doors. We need 8 goons and we need 2 of them at each door. They were very focused on the brass tacks of physical reality and physical power and physical force, because they knew that the governing comes from that monopoly of violence that the state has. And I just don't think that our current generation of Democratic leaders or Republican leaders has the gravity or the connection to reality to think in those terms. I mean, I really don't think it ever occurred to Nancy Pelosi to ask, how many security personnel do we have at the Capitol? Who are those people loyal to? Do I know any of them? Do you think Nancy Pelosi talks to her security staff like a person, or do you think she just snaps her fingers and
Yeah, it's hard,
and,
hard to say. I mean, I could imagine her doing that. Yeah.
I
I
mean,
don't really know.
I don't know either. And Tom DeLay was a wonderful person on an individual level, and Lloyd Doggett's a terrible asshole. So you never can tell by somebody's politics what their personal conduct is going to be. I mean, Tom DeLay was called the concierge of the Congress because he took such good care of every congressman that he was aware of. He was partisan and he favored the Republicans over the Democrats. But if you're a Republican staffer and your kid had an abscessed tooth, you could go talk to Tom DeLay and he would probably help you fix it back when he was the majority leader of the House. And, so you can't, just because somebody's a crook and a goon doesn't mean that they're not sophisticated enough to be polite to the people that work for them. But my experience has been that most of these incredibly wealthy and powerful politicians are not nice to the people that work for them, are not aware of the people that work for them, and just assume that the government's going to take care of it. Oh, these people break the law. Oh, well, the government will arrest them. Well, you are the government. We are the government. We have to do this ourselves, or it's not going to get done. And the January 6th thing, that boat has sailed. I mean, the seriousness of that would have had to been responded with something at least as serious as the Watergate trials or the Nuremberg trials. I mean, incredibly serious. Like, do you remember how seriously people took the Ken Starr impeachment of Clinton in the 90s?
Yeah.
It would have had to have been at least that serious. But, our politics has degenerated into total farce. And so, for me,
It's
with
a
Biden,
reality TV show.
yeah. And I definitely prefer Biden to Trump, but just because one person's not a floridly psychotic doesn't mean that they're a successful president. Like you can have Caligula and Commodus, who are both terrible monsters of Roman emperors. They both sucked as Roman emperors. Maybe Commodus was better than Caligula. I'd hate to be in the position, and nobody got to vote on that, but I'd hate to be in the position of choosing between Caligula and Commodus. But one of them was probably better than the other one, but ultimately they both fail. And so
there's one guy who I think is actually like the epitome of current politics. He totally represents what he's like, the ultimate
Santos.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he's
the ultimate politician, man.
Well, you mentioned the rich and powerful politicians, and that I feel is a big part of the problem on both parties.
Yeah,
they don't stop campaigning ever. There's there's no one that is going in there just to do the job of governance. No one really knows about governance anymore. It's all about, we've got to do something to get money into the campaign. We've got to always be thinking about the campaign, and no one's really thinking about running the country. Not all the time. They're always on the campaign trail.
Yeah, and one of my formative experiences, one of the reasons that I don't work in politics anymore, is that in 2007, I was in DC and I had helped elect a number of Congress people in 2006. And so I was up on the Hill and at the DNC meeting some Congress people I'd worked with, and they had the staffers were on the Hill. The hired help was on the Hill writing the legislation. The Congress people were in the DNC building in cubicles, dialing for dollars and being harangued by Rahm Emanuel, who's running around waving his cut off stub finger in their faces and screaming at people if they're, I heard you talking to your wife. This is money time. You're wasting my time. This is money time. And screaming, this is money time, at these putatively elected officials who are supposed to be representing 500,000 people each. And it was just like working at Southwestern Bell and watching a line manager yell at people for saying, no, you don't tell them how much the usual package costs. That's why we don't have a usual package. You've got to give them the whole rigmarole to get them to buy more crap. I mean, it was the exact same mentality of people in cubicles slaving away, dialing for dollars, and some bully yelling at them, while the government is being run by 22-year-olds who, had worked for Joe Lieberman the year before. And now they're writing legislation for these idealistic, progressive candidates that we worked so hard to elect. And it's just a broken system, and it doesn't produce good outcomes. It doesn't produce good people. So
how do we fix it?
It's got to crash. I think. I don't think it can be fixed.
I thought of, when I voted for Biden, I thought that was just a terrible thing to have to do, because I knew it was just another machine politician. He's the old school, and there's not going to be any significant change. It'll be a little less, radical than Trump, but he's still part of that old school that has kept our government, pretty much in a suspended state of animation. There's not a lot of real change.
No, Biden was a leader in every bad decision in the last 40 years. I mean, you got to give the guy his due. He was a leading neoliberal politician throughout the Reagan and Clinton era. So he was hit deep in every bad idea we've had since then, and you're not going to get reform by electing Biden. You're just not.
Who would you run? Who would you run as a Democrat?
At this point, 2020 was, the idea was, it's an open primary. There's no incumbent. So what an exciting opportunity to get the backbenchers out here, get them some shine. We've surely got a dozen talented Democrats that are ready to step up for this, and what happened was that the governors, like Jay Inslee of Washington State, who I think was one of the more promising candidates, he got no attention. He's in Washington State. He's 3 hours behind the East Coast media centers. He didn't hire a Liz Smith like Pete Buttigieg did. He did not have that mega power press person that can get, the networks to pay attention to you. So it was like he didn't even run. Meanwhile, we've got Pete Buttigieg, the mayor of whatever dump he was the mayor of, with this appalling record as a McKinsey consultant, and just, as a mayor, he had a pretty bad record of racist police enforcement and et cetera, and becomes this media darling, and is now this, I would say, the worst Secretary of Transportation in the history of the job, unless there's somebody from World War I or whatever that I'm not aware of. But his performance as Secretary of Transportation has been just clown car abysmal. But the net outcome of it was that Kamala Harris and Pete were elevated in these positions where now they're essentially the number 2 and number 3 Democrat and sort of heirs apparent. And we've devolved into the status where they can't figure out how to get rid of the vice president. Look at the history of this country. FDR got rid of the vice president like every term. He had a new one, and Biden is in the situation where he feels beholden to the African-American, demographic that helped him win in South Carolina. So no way is he going to make a move to get rid of Kamala. It seems pretty apparent to me she's a disastrous failure. She's polling even worse than Biden is. She polls, he's losing to Trump by 5 points. She's losing to Trump by 8 points. Like, what are we doing? But the rest of the candidates that we had in 2020, Cory Booker shamed himself. Elizabeth Warren, I think, ruined what credibility she had by staying in the race so long and helping hand it to Biden. And Bernie did the same thing. Bernie, I think got worked. And if the timing of it had been just a little bit different, if the timing of the specific primary days had just been off by a week or two, Sanders might have won it in a walk, but he didn't. And he's made peace with Biden and there's no opposition within the Democratic Party at this point. If you look at AOC or Bernie, or Ilhan Omar, or all these people, the squad that we had such high hopes for a couple of years ago, they're not opposing Biden at all in any material way, shape, or form, nor are they preparing themselves for a challenge to Biden. They're very much on Team Democrat, which is really scary because I think Team Democrat's about to sleepwalk into Team DeSantis, although watching Trump and DeSantis go at each other, it's hard to fathom how is that going to produce a presidential contender. They're already calling each other child molesters. Trump's the only one that's gone that far.
I think they need to just set those two up in a cage match. That would be good entertainment there.
I would never push a 78-year-old man into a cage match, or however old Trump is. But yeah, this is basically, it's entertainment and circuses.
We'll talk about circuses. I have friends who are part of the crowd that worships Elon. They're Muskies. And they think he needs to be the president. And when I hear that, it's like I get horrified. And I think, well, look what he did to Twitter. Maybe we need to get him president for like 6 weeks, just long enough to really destroy the whole infrastructure. And then maybe we can rebuild it in something that works.
Maybe.
But he's not the guy.
Yeah, I don't know. But that's now you're sounding like Steve Bannon, though. That's kind of his thing. Let's just smash it all to pieces so we can rebuild it. There's no guarantee we're going to rebuild it as anything better. In fact, it's extremely unlikely.
And that's why revolutions are so feared,
Yeah.
But there's a time and place when that's the only possibility. But this country is too old, too exhausted, too divided, too intellectually degenerate to produce, a positive political revolution. I just don't see any hope of that happening. But I do hope we can pull out of our collapse and not start World War III. And, because the thing about our current moment is, I watched the 2003 Iraq invasion happened, I had a front row seat for that. I was working, for Bush's TV consultants and pollsters, and saw that stuff coming very close. And it was terrifying. I mean, there was a period of time when it was literally, I was afraid to say in Austin, Texas, I don't know if invading Iraq really is going to do anything, is a good thing. And, Howard Dean came along and kind of made it okay to speak up and express your concerns. But I found the information environment around the Ukraine and the Taiwan situations to be even worse, filled with, we didn't have Twitter bots in 2003. Now that's basically all we have. And the media is so appallingly ignorant. I mean, it's very difficult just to figure out what is actually happening on the ground in Ukraine. I mean, it's very difficult just to figure out who's winning and who's losing. What are the casualty rates? We get these estimates of the casualty rates. The Ukrainian numbers are somewhat consistent, although they're almost never released. But the Russian numbers vary wildly, and that's just from Western sources. That's just if you compare like the BBC's most conservative count, which is only about 15,000, with the Washington Post's most aggressive count, which is over 200,000. Like that's a pretty big gulf, and I don't have any faith in our military leadership and our political military. I have more faith in the Pentagon than I do in the State Department, for example, but I don't have much faith in either of them. And I just, going into World War III on multiple fronts with this team at the helm and the potential of an even worse team taking over is terrifying. And I mean, I don't know. I'm just hoping we can survive the next 10 years, and hopefully that will resolve the crises. And, maybe some of us will get to limp along through our elderly years without another, get the World War over with, and maybe we'll survive, but I think we just have to go through the crises, the multiple crises that are bearing down on us. And it's terrifying.
It's going to be a tough run. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of us aren't going to make it.
I have held a kind of skepticism about it. It's really been hard for me to believe that the United States would go full on fascist, which now people believe that's what's happening right now. And I just kind of don't buy it. I don't think that's where people's heads are at. But in my life, I have never seen fascists with the kind of strength and power that they seem to have today.
Yeah, and
I know that they did not too long before I was born. Like back in the World War II era, there was a very strong fascist element in this country, and there were people who supported Hitler.
And look at the post-Reconstruction South and the whole country post-Reconstruction after 1877. That was essentially a fascist government. I mean, it was finalizing the genocide of the Native Americans. It was de facto re-enslaving African Americans after they've been free, and using mass murder as the tool. I mean, lynching essentially any white person in the South could kill any black person in the South for any reason at any time, for
and get away
70
with it,
years. Yeah. If that's not fascism, I don't know what it is. I mean, there was over 100 lynchings in Waco, Texas. 17 of them had postcards that went out with them. Have you ever looked at those postcards from the lynching?
No.
Those faces are the same people you see at the mall today. I mean, fascism has a very normal face. And, it's these zombies at a picnic watching some, black kid get lynched. It's horrific. But that was where we came from. I mean, Goebbels and Goering would both tell you, we modeled the Nazi plan on the United States. We thought what y'all did with annihilating an entire race of Native Americans and enslaving Africans was the model. That was where they got their game plan.
Yeah.
So
I didn't realize that.
Oh yeah. Read some Goering and read him talking about the United States. And the mistake the Germans made was that they invaded Russia when they didn't have the resources to beat them. If they had gone for Iraq or whatever and just taken England's oil reserves, all bets are off. But the reason that the Americans were able to annihilate this whole continent was because Europe had this giant population boom for several hundred years, and we were able to just import Europeans and Africans to work and wipe the slate clean of Native Americans. I mean, there have only been 2 continental genocides in human history that I'm aware of. One is in North America, from the 1400s to the 20th century. Another one is Han China, when the Chinese wiped out all the ethnic groups or most all the ethnic groups in the Chinese subcontinent. So
well, on that cheerful note, I will note that we have come to the end
And
of
you'll
our
have to
hour.
return for another round here, because I'm sure there's a lot more we can discuss in both music and politics.
Yeah, we got to cheer people up.
I gotta find something cheery to say.
Let's go looking for some cheerful stuff, and we'll bring it back for another one.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me, guys.
Okay, man. We'll see you soon. Thanks for joining us.
You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lepkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.